Hello, and welcome to the first in a series of briefings we're holding to help build a better understanding in Congress of the impacts and harms of carbon capture and hydrogen infrastructure. This briefing series is being hosted by the Center for International Environmental Law, Food and Water Watch, Friends of the Earth, Whale Change International, the Indigenous Environmental Network, Institute for Policy Studies, and Climate Policy Program. We're holding this series largely because Congress is enabling the expansion of carbon capture and hydrogen infrastructure, particularly because of billions in federal funding and infrastructure in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as continuing efforts that we're seeing to include even more funding for these fossil fuel industry-backed climate scams in the Manchin-led bipartisan energy push, as well as in potential inclusion in a upcoming reconciliation package. There are also efforts in the administration to fast-track permitting of CO2 pipelines and CO2 injection wells, which is also very concerning. And it's important that Congress reject these attempts to fund and fast-track this infrastructure. And we hope these series will help give you, as congressional staffers, the tools and knowledge you need to help stand up strong against these efforts and educate your boss as to why this is an important effort, important programs to stop from moving forward. Next Thursday at 2 p.m., we'll host our second briefing in this series, where we'll take a look at a deeper dive into health, environmental justice impacts of carbon capture development, and plan on doing 2 briefings a month through the summer. In the series, we will discuss plans the fossil fuel industry and big agricultural interest have for pushing this massive nationwide build out of carbon capture infrastructure. And the briefing today will share really a big picture understanding of the significant problems with carbon capture, how federal subsidies and other policies are enabling this build out, and why groups who are truly concerned about the climate crisis and environmental justice have such strong opposition to this build out of carbon capture and hydrogen infrastructure. Now, while the idea of reducing emissions from fossil fuels sounds appealing, a deeper look at the big picture of carbon capture exposes significant harms that this carbon capture build out will cause to communities across the United States. CCS is also expensive, it's dirty, and it's really ineffective at addressing the climate crisis, and can actually make the climate crisis worse while perpetuating increasing harms on disadvantaged communities. Well, I will introduce our speakers before we begin, and want to let folks know we've received questions from the audience in advance, which we've shared with the panelists prior to the presentation to help them incorporate some of these answers to the questions in their presentations. And some others we'll address during the Q&A section of the briefing. However, if folks do have questions that come up during the briefing, you can use the question box at the bottom of your the screen in order to submit additional questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible during the briefing. I also want to make sure that folks are aware that we're recording the briefing so that we can share it afterwards as a follow-up to this presentation. And we'll also be sharing handouts and other materials that the speakers have provided for this briefing, and we'll be sending it to all of you after this is over. I am Jim Walsh, the Policy Director for Food and Water Watch, and I am truly honored to moderate this panel exploring the big picture impacts of carbon capture development with our distinguished panelists who I'll introduce now. First, I'd like to introduce June Sequeira, who is a visiting scholar at the New School for Social Research and a senior fellow of research at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center and a senior research associate at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at the University College London. June initiated and directed a project to investigate the scientific literature on industrial carbon removal methods from a perspective of public need. The findings include the discovery that industrial carbon capture methods, most widely subsidized in the US, emit more CO2 in the air than they remove, failing to reduce the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. We're also joined by Basa Sen. He's the Climate Justice Project Director at the Institute for Policy Studies, where his work focuses on climate solutions that address racial, economic, gender, and other forms of inequality. Stephen Feit is an attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law's Climate and Energy Program, and Stephen's work focuses primarily on climate liability and finance. Stevens specializes in developing legal strategies to hold the fossil fuel companies accountable for the impacts of climate change and for failures to acknowledge climate risks. He graduated from Cornell University with a BS in applied economics and management, and then attended the law school at NYU, where he also served as editor of the Environmental Law Journal and worked for multiple nonprofit organizations. Marta Dina Aguillo is executive director at Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles. And for the past 32 years, Marta Dina has served in the nonprofit sector as an advocate, community organizer, and coalition builder. While working as a health educator in the 90s, Martha had an epiphany, and she realized that although early detection can prevent death from breast cancer, it does not prevent breast cancer, which is being increasingly linked to exposure of environmental toxins. And since that realization, Marta Dina has dedicated her career to the environmental justice movement and has lectured nationwide in the use of precautionary principle policies. She's an active board member of numerous organizations, including the Californians for Pesticide Reform, California Environmental Rights Alliance, Californians for a Healthy and Green Economy. And she also co-founded the Los Angeles County Asthma Coalition and the Coalition for Environmental Health and Justice, and was appointed to the Cal EPA's Environmental Justice Committee and the California Air Resource Board's Global Warming Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. And now we will hear from our speakers. First, I will turn it over to Basav Sen from the Institute for Policy Studies Climate Policy Program, who will discuss the big picture build out of carbon capture in the United States. Basav, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that welcome, Jim. I'm going to talk briefly about just how vast the scale of the recent US commitment to carbon capture is. Next slide, please. So first, I'm going to talk just about the amount of money the federal government is putting into carbon capture. So the FY 2021 Appropriations Act that was passed in December of 2020 had a bill added to it called the Use It Act, which throws a whole lot of money at carbon capture. And what you'll see in this chart is just how much the funding from 2021 through 25 is compared to earlier levels of funding for carbon capture. Next slide, please. And this is the carbon capture funding in the IIJA, otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. About $12 billion for funding directly for carbon capture and storage and what's called direct air capture, and another $8 billion or so for hydrogen. Now, why am I including hydrogen in the funding for carbon capture? Well, it turns out that some 95% of the hydrogen that's made in the US today is actually made from fracked gas in a two-step chemical reaction that produces CO2 as a byproduct. And so-called clean blue hydrogen entails capturing that CO2. And so essentially, if you're claiming that hydrogen from fracked gas is carbon neutral, what you have added to the hydrogen production process is carbon capture. And the IIJA sets up 3 regional hydrogen hubs and requires that at least 2 of them have to be in shale gas regions in order to utilize fracked gas as the source material for hydrogen. So that's why I'm including hydrogen funding in the bigger picture of CCS funding. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'll give you an idea of just the sheer physical and geographical scale of the proposed CCS rollout. So it's important to note that the current footprint of CCS in the United States is pretty small. So this proposed build out builds from a very low base, and that's why it is so staggeringly large in percentage terms. If you look at the sum total of CCS facilities in different sectors, whether it be ethanol and other bioenergy type applications, or different chemical and petrochemical applications, etc. There were 12 at the time of this figure from the Congressional Research Service, and now I believe it's up to 13. So really, it is a very small footprint. Next slide, please. However, this is the footprint of just refineries alone. And so if you were to fit all refineries in the US with carbon capture, this is the number of facilities you'd be looking at. Next slide, please. Okay, this map shows shale gas regions in the US. First of all, it just shows you how extensive the geography of shale gas is. But there's a couple of reasons I want you to look at shale gas regions in particular. One, as I mentioned earlier, is hydrogen, because there could be a massive rollout of hydrogen production along with CCS in these regions. The second reason is plastics and petrochemicals. One of the dirty secrets of fracking is that it produces a massive volume of natural gas liquids, and the most economical use that industry can put it to is by making plastics and petrochemicals. And plastics production produces a massive amount of greenhouse gases. So again, there is an impetus for carbon capture associated with petrochemicals. Next slide, please. And this is the potential CO2 pipeline network in the central US alone, if there were a massive CCS build out in the United States. And just for reference, the yellow lines are the current CO2 pipeline network. Note especially that the build out is going to target the Gulf region, the Midwest, both the North Dakota shale region and the corn ethanol production areas in parts of the Midwest, and the Permian Basin region in Texas. Next slide, please. And now add to that other sectors where you can have a massive CCS rollout, like steel, cement, corn ethanol, and power plants, gas and coal power plants. So there will be a massive build out of CCS, both the carbon capturing infrastructure and the pipelines and the injection well system, if US policy is to capture CO2 emissions instead of preventing them from being generated in the first place. And here are two estimates of capital investment from sources who actually support and promote CCS. So these are not cherry-picked high-end numbers from opponents of CCS. And these estimates are 5 trillion worldwide and up to 500 billion in the US through 2050. Thanks. That brings me to the end of my presentation, and over to you, Jim.
Jim, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Basa, for sharing. I think it's particularly striking to really see the big picture of this infrastructure, particularly given the industry really only focuses on this idea of claimed emissions that they can reduce, and really ignore the fact that much of this infrastructure will go to support plastic and petrochemical development, will require massive pipelines, and really play a role in delaying our transition to clean energy. And so thank you very much. Now I'm going to call on Stephen from the Center for International Environmental Law to discuss the policies and financing that underlying this CCS development. So Stephen, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. So I want to talk about what's behind the push for CCS. My name is Stephen Feit. I'm an attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law, and thanks for having me here. I want to start by addressing the fact that carbon capture is quite old technology. You can see on the left a patent from the 50s issued to Standard Oil for production of pure carbon dioxide, essentially removing CO2 from waste streams. In 1980, you had Imperial Oil, an Exxon subsidiary in Canada, discussing their understanding of the ability to remove CO2 from stack gases, but it would double the cost of power generation. And I just bring this up because CCS gets pitched as this shiny new technology, as if it's just going to get really cheap and really great if we invest money in it. But as you've heard and as you will hear, CCS is not new. It's been around for a really, really long time. The second thing to understand is that there is no commercial market for captured carbon dioxide except for use in enhanced oil recovery. On the left, you can see a list from the Global CCS Institute of carbon capture projects. More than 80% of global carbon capture capacity is used for enhanced oil recovery, more than 95% of US capacity for EOR. And the reason is because most of that's used for gas separation, not actually post-combustion capture, right? It's used for separating out the CO2 from natural underground sources to market gas. What you see is that when there is no commercial market, and this is actually pulled from a permit application for a cracker project from Chevron Phillips, that when they have to pay for it, the industry considers it technically infeasible, a technically infeasible control option under the Clean Air Act. Not only is EOR the only real commercial market for CO2, CCS is really the only market for CO2 for EOR. There are limited sources of affordable carbon dioxide. And about a little over a decade ago, a number of groups got together to form the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative, now the Carbon Capture Coalition, to promote policies to secure sources of affordable CO2 for the purpose of developing additional enhanced oil recovery. This is really important because CCS gets talked about in a lot of ways, but one of the primary drivers for this push and this build out is actually about securing those CO2 streams for enhanced oil recovery. But the other thing that CCS promises is the promise of fossil fuels without CO2, right? Carbon capture is fundamentally the answer. How do you continue business as usual while claiming to be Paris aligned, which is exactly more or less what Shell did in 2018. They released their Sky scenario, which discussed how they would achieve Paris warming targets, or a possible scenario to achieve those targets. What you can see, if you look, this is kind of hard chart to read, but you can see really enormous amounts of fossil fuel use, even as far out as 2100. And the way they made that math square is by assuming 10,000 giant carbon capture facilities built over that period of time. Finally, I think it's really important to stress the distinction between CCS on paper and CCS in practice. So you might see CCS, here claims like the IPCC requires CCS use, and CCS does appear in IPCC models, but when you actually read what they say about it, they caution against reliance on CCS repeatedly. They assume in the models capture rates of 90 to 95%, but continually warn against the fact that CCS actually incurs a huge energy penalty and doesn't reduce costs, or costs have not dropped at the rate anticipated. So again, when you have models that simply assume, oh, capture 90 to 95% of emissions and the cost is actually going to go down, CCS does appear in models. When you look at it in actuality, you see the reality is much worse. These are just 4 examples: 2 hydrogen production facilities and 2 coal-fired power plants. Their actual capture rates and their capture rates when including the energy from the carbon capture equipment itself. This doesn't even include additional upstream emissions from additional energy required or downstream emissions from oil produced from enhanced oil recovery. But you can see carbon capture has a real history of failing to achieve these extremely high capture rates that are proposed by industry and exist in models. That does not stop the industry from continuing to make these claims. Project Tundra says 90%, Starwood 90%, the OGCI investment over 90% of emissions. However, you may recall at the very tail end of 2021, there was a debate over whether or not to expand the 45Q tax credit in Build Back Better. This is the tax credit that provides money for carbon capture, either underground storage or enhanced oil recovery. There was a proposal to include a 75% capture rate in that part of the bill. Groups supporting carbon capture wrote a letter decrying the 75% capture rate, claiming that it would basically make it impossible to actually get financing for facilities because even a 75% capture rate couldn't be guaranteed. So with that, I will just sum up by saying CCS is an old technology that costs too much with a long history of failure that serves to perpetuate existing fossil fuel use and increase oil production. Thank you.
Tim, you're muted.
Thanks. Thank you, Stephen. To summarize, I think I would say that based on what you've presented here is that the carbon capture build out is really prefaced on misinformation and lies perpetuated by an industry who's currently gouging the public, at the pumps, but also, making billions of dollars in profits, and they're happy to cash in on billions in public dollars that will allow them to continue polluting our communities and gouging consumers. And so thank you very much, Stephen. Next, I will turn it over to Marta-Dina Aguiló, who's Executive Director for Physicians for Social Responsibility, LA, and she'll discuss the harms that CCUS is causing for disadvantaged communities. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much. I'm Marta-Dina Aguiló. My background is actually started as a health educator many years ago, educating both community members and physicians around disease prevention and health promotion. And when I think of what prevention means, it's a little bit stunning about as we've been forced to learn about carbon capture, because in California, it is chasing federal dollars that is driving, and the power of the fossil fuel industry is driving California's supposed climate leadership. So next slide. You know what, this is not the most current one, but that's fine. So currently in the California budget, there is $1 million for carbon capture and sequestration. And this is the message that we as the environmental justice community hear. Yeah, we hear you. Yeah, we kind of get that this stuff isn't working, but we're still going to do it because we'd rather do this than actually change our behavior. And in health education, that is one of the key things we learn. To stop a problem that you're facing, that's because of something you're using, the best way to approach it is stop using that. So for many of us who've been working on oil setbacks and much work in California. The CCS, next slide, these proposals are incredibly threatening to, and I'll show you why that's incredibly threatening to our communities. So there's a number of bills that are, again, chasing federal dollars, trying to define what is going to be, what kind of technologies for where, and we've been able to at least introduce the concept, our communities don't want you to do this, and I'll explain why. It's also one that's rooted in the science that you've just heard, that it doesn't work and we don't need it, and that there is a lot of other things that we can and should be doing to reduce greenhouse gas. One, address air pollution. That's what a key concern for communities. Next slide. And asking the central question, who benefits and who lives with the burdens? And that is what we mean when we say center on justice, center your choices and policy choices and where you spend your money, particularly things like Justice 40. The idea that money would be used for direct air capture to extend the life of fossil fuel industries is the opposite of environmental justice. So next slide. So California has this amazing tool called CalEnviroScreen. It's not perfect, but it tells you where some of the most overburdened communities are. So the darker the blue, the more the burdens are, and it's about 20 different indicators of burden, from air quality, water quality, impaired water bodies, language isolation, income, some very crude health indicators. But what you see is what we experience as a state. The Central Valley of California bears a disproportionate burden, as does Southern California. And certainly where I live and work in South Los Angeles and areas that are near the ports and on through the goods movement corridors, that's where you end up seeing those darker colors. Next slide. Remember where those maps are. So these are proposed projects that could be part of carbon capture, storage, and a network throughout the state. There you see the Central Valley, there you see the dots. And so it is a direct threat because we currently live with fossil fuel infrastructure. Most of the direct air capture will go on that existing infrastructure, therefore deepening the inequality, adding to the cumulative pollution burdens, and forcing communities to continue to be sacrifice zones, when what we're asking for in terms of solutions are just transition, decentralized, and distributed power, so that we can start the transition, decarbonization, but understanding that those energy sources have to be clean. Next slide. I forgot my timer, so I'm going to expect somebody to tell me where I am. So again, these are proposed projects that we're already talking about. Communities, we're saying, we see the lobbyists and the project proponents on the ground talking to folks about this project, figuring out what they can throw money, if they can throw money at communities to say yes to continuing to be part of this incredibly toxic industry that is driving deep to health inequalities throughout these regions. And again, they are in the Central Valley. The state of California is asking the Central Valley to bear the brunt of the burdens for the benefits for somebody else. And that is, again, the definition of injustice. Next slide. I'm going to go through these quick because I'm running out of time and I want to talk. So again, these are some of the why we view this as a direct threat to, the governor has made public announcements about our need to end fossil fuel and transition. But this is, again, the opposite of that transition. Next slide. Projects in the Delta. And we've been to project proponent meetings, and again, they're overstating the effectiveness of the technology. No one is looking at worst case scenarios and what happens if there are CO2 leaks that are deadly. And they are only modeling these best case scenarios. Everything's going to be fine. We're suddenly going to change on a dime and be able to actually regulate and protect environmental justice communities. California, while it has a reputation of doing well on climate policy, it has failed to protect frontline communities from the devastating impacts of the fossil fuel industry. And we do not expect that to be different. And it requires, next slide, 100 years, requires long-term monitoring and storage. And we don't do well with long-term monitoring, and most of our storage is leaked. This is another project that was being proposed. They suddenly pulled the permit. Next slide. You can go through all of these. You can keep moving. Again, this myth that we are going to somehow be able to regulate this and make it safe. I want to remind folks that most of our regulations are not designed to protect public health. They are designed to give the polluters rules of the game for them to continue to do what they do and calculate some, risk for the community that ends up not being protective. And we know it's not protective because we know that those same communities also have huge health disparities. Next slide. The people who got us to this problem are not going to be the ones who are going to give us the solution. And so most of the industry is behind this because it allows them to continue to do what they've done. And, when we talk about this, it feels like the new climate denialism is that somehow with accounting tricks for technology that's just about, on the horizon is going to allow us to continue to do the practices that we know are harming the planet. And you've heard all the speakers. For all those reasons, this will continue to drive inequality and drive health disparities for communities that are already overburdened. And we're tired of being sacrifice zones. And we're tired of being guinea pigs for technologies that aren't going to work, aren't centered on solutions that are community driven and bring power and new economic opportunities in the transition for a broader set of stakeholders. Next slide. And I think I'm done. These are some of the research institutions that are funding this. I worked on tobacco many years ago, and this reminds me of, creating an industry within the academy to support false solutions. Next slide. I'm done. I think I should end because I'm out of time.
Marta, thank you so much. And we'll have an opportunity during the questions to come back and answer a little bit more about these. But I want to just, really thank you for sharing that. Because I think, one of the things that came to mind for me is that all of a sudden we're supposed to believe that the fossil fuel industry, who's been poisoning communities for decades and destroying our climate, all of a sudden cares about these things. It's really beyond disbelief that is being put forward, and real people are harmed by this, and so thank you so much for sharing that. Next, I'm going to turn it over to June Sequeira, the executive director of Public Goods Institute, and she's going to talk about how CCS is failing to address the climate crisis. And thank you so much, June.
Thank you. Sorry for the delay. Okay, there we go. Thank you, Jim. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about why these mechanical methods of carbon capture don't work in a little bit more depth. I'm a visiting scholar with the New School for Social Research in New York, and although I live in California, and have been looking at carbon capture and storage for about the last 3 years from the perspective of public policy and public need, and also from the perspective of biophysical constraints and imperatives. So if we say that carbon capture doesn't really work, what do we mean by work? So by work, what we defined it as is defining the problem and the need. So the problem, as most of us know, is the excess buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere. We're at 415 parts per million now, vastly up from the 280 ppm at the start of the Industrial Revolution. So the need is to reduce that concentration of CO2. So if a method doesn't reduce that concentration, then we define it as not working. Two types of carbon capture. One is capturing the CO2 at smokestacks at the source. The other is pulling the CO2 out of the air the CO2 that's already in the air, pulling it out of the air. Important to understand is that source capture, all the kinds of carbon capture that most of the speakers have been talking about so far mostly, is source capture. And it's just really important to reiterate that it doesn't take any CO2 out of the air. So it doesn't meet the basic threshold criterion of reducing atmospheric CO2. In fact, it actually puts more CO2 into the air in some cases. Nevertheless, these are the carbon capture projects going on in the US right now. There's 12 of them, and they're at these various kinds of facilities. None is at a power plant. This is a list of them, and you can see on the right-hand side, the EOR, enhanced oil recovery. Almost all of them are using the captured CO2 for drilling, for squeezing out more oil from existing wells. Every single one of these projects is enabled by public subsidies. Were it not for the public subsidies, these projects would not exist. Enhanced oil recovery, you probably all know, but just to review briefly, it is a process where CO2 is pumped into the ground, into existing oil wells in order to force out new additional oil out of those wells. This is just a list of the carbon capture CCS projects at power plants in the United States, every one of which failed, and every one of which was subsidized by taxpayers, was paid for by taxpayers. Again, they wouldn't have happened at all if it weren't for taxpayer money, and they all failed. This is just to show that when CCS is done at a power plant, it's an energy sink. Those plants that failed did operate, some of them, a few of them operated, a couple of them operated at for a very short while. CCS at power plants cannibalizes energy, it raises costs, it can double or triple the price of electricity to customers. Is it extremely expensive to customers if it actually worked? So here's some numbers on the way in which it doesn't work at. This is one study of CCS at coal-fired power plants where the captured CO2 is used for EOR. It puts 3.4 to 4.7 tons of CO2 into the air for each ton that it removes. Very, very counterproductive. What about direct air capture? A brief view of energy consumption and land use. So DAC at a climate relevant scale, 1 gigaton of CO2 would require an amount of energy to power it that is equal to the amount of electricity generated in the United States in 2017, an enormous amount of power, of energy to power DAC at, just the beginning of a climate relevant scale. Most of the DAC, the DAC that is the method that is most easily scaled up is what's called a liquid solvent system. And that system has to use fossil fuel to power it for the most part. A little bit of it can be powered by non-fossil sources like solar. But that process, studies have shown, emit from 1.5 to 3.4 tons of CO2 for each ton captured. Again, entirely counterproductive. The largest DAC plant to be built in the United States is one that's in the process now to be built by Occidental Petroleum and DAC company called Carbon Engineering. It's going to be mostly fossil fuel powered because it uses this liquid solvent system. All of the captured CO2 in this DAC plant will be used for enhanced oil recovery, for oil extraction, and their business plan relies entirely on government subsidies, the 45Q tax credit and the low carbon fuel standard of California. They've been very upfront that they require the subsidies in order to build and operate this thing. What if you switch to solar power for 1 gigaton capture? It would take a land area. DAC would take a land area 10 times the size of the state of Delaware. You almost always hear that the footprint for DAC is tiny. Not true when you talk about getting it to scale, if you're talking about a non-fossil fuel powered DAC. I won't go over this slide, but basically DAC solar powered would use as much land as biological methods, mainly trees, to remove and store 1 gigaton. This is something that our recent research has revealed. Just to really put this in perspective of scale, globally, we emit about 39 gigatons, 39 billion tons of CO2 per year. Of that, the United States is 5 gigatons. To zero in on the 5 gigatons of the United States, how much are we removing right now by mechanical methods, by these DAC and CCS? None, zero. As I said, the CCS at sources doesn't remove anything, and the DAC direct air capture is so trivial. What's going on right now is it doesn't even register in terms of climate. This is this is the only large, not in large, but DAC plant on the planet right now, the so-called Orca plant by the company called Climeworks. As one writer said, in a year, it'll capture just 3 seconds worth of humanity's CO2. It doesn't use fossil fuels. It uses the thermal energy in underground in Iceland. The US Department of Energy recently funded a demonstration program in the United States with the University of Illinois, where they're going to basically roll out some demos using the Climeworks system in 3 states, Louisiana, California, and Wyoming. And they have a goal of reaching 0.0004 gigatons of CO2 capture and storage by 2027 after 18 years of development. That's where they hope to get. What to do with captured CO2, utilization or injection and burial. I'm not going to talk about utilization a lot. I can answer questions on that, except to say that this is meaning usually captured CO2 for products or processes. It's counterproductive. It's a trivial amount in terms of demand, as Basov said, or both. Underground storage has tremendous risks, leakage, blowouts, et cetera, that some of the speakers already talked about. This is a list of some of the leakage, blowouts, and ruptures that have already occurred with CO2 from pipelines and underground storage. This is actually from a DOE, Department of Energy, handbook on the risks of underground storage of CO2. And this is just to point out that what happens downstream with these wastes, what are the residual wastes, where do they go? What happens to local communities? Are we going to have a situation on our hands like burying nuclear waste? There are legal and liability issues that, again, I won't go into in detail. If somebody wants to know more, I can talk about this but there will be inevitably be a lot of liabilities, and the plan right now in the states that are passing legislation is to turn the liability over to the public sector. Just a couple more slides. How is CO2, how does it get to these storage sites? This is a map by Princeton that indicates that tens of thousands of pipelines will be required across the country. And this is what happens when you have a CO2 pipeline. Many of you probably know about this, but this is the article about the scores of people who were sickened and sent to the hospital by the CO2 pipeline rupture in Mississippi in 2020. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, June. It really, I think, begs the question of why are we talking about carbon capture as a climate solution when the evidence shows that it's actually not that, and will not only not address the climate crisis, but will harm vulnerable communities, as we've heard. And so we've received a number of questions, and so I'm going to ask our panelists to all come on. I think you're all on with your cameras now, great. And then we'll go through and ask some questions. If there's other questions that folks want to ask, please use the Q&A button and we'll try to get to all of them, but we have a good number of questions so far. And so first, I want to pose this question, maybe right back to you, June, and if anybody else has some thoughts on this, they could. But one of the questions asked is, what should we do instead of CCS to address carbon currently in the atmosphere?
Well, the most important answer is to stop putting CO2 into the air and to transition to non-carbon fuel sources. I haven't worked on that, so I can't speak to to renewable energy, but that is the answer, obviously. Aside from that, if you're talking about carbon capture, carbon removal, I'm just we've completed a study and I'm completing a paper that shows that biological methods of carbon capture, trees, grasslands restoration, changing farming methods, et cetera, are far superior to these mechanical methods on 3 criteria: effectiveness, efficiency, and co-impacts. And that paper should be coming out hopefully pretty soon. But all the evidence is very clear that these biological methods are far superior in efficiency, effectiveness, and co-impacts than mechanical methods. So that's what we should be funding, and we're not. So the money should be moving from the mechanical to the biological methods.
Thank you very much, June. Martha Dina, there's a process going on at the California CARB, or the Air Resource Board, dealing with scoping plans. Can you talk about those plans and the EJ impacts and reliance on CCS?
Yes, so as part of California's climate law, we have a scoping plan that gets done every 4 years. And so right now, in fact, it was just released last week. They have been doing modeling and other things to see how we get to carbon neutrality and whether we're going to get to carbon neutrality by 2030 or 2045. And one of the challenges is this concept of net zero, which sort of encourages accounting tricks to reach those goals. And so as part of a big part of that scoping plan are reductions that we're going to get through carbon capture. So I think one of those pilots that is modeled after a project that I don't know how would work in California, but so there's heavily reliant on carbon capture and sequestration and hydrogen to get us to carbon neutrality, versus what the environmental justice community has been saying is focus on the biological, focus on natural working lands, focus on a just transition, you know, do what the governor said and figure out a date for us when we're going to stop extracting oil. And that isn't the route that the California Air Resources Board is taking. They are chasing money and are making a case that we could do this, right? That we can figure out how to do direct air capture. And we're being asked questions like, under what conditions would you say yes to this facility being in your neighborhood? And I think that's, you know, it's a shameful kind of question to ask any community when we know it doesn't work, where everything we're hearing, you know, from June's research and everything that we're learning is that it doesn't work. And it's the opportunity cost of actually doing things the way the environmental justice community has been recommending. And just in case folks don't know, many of the things that our community said would happen with this climate law from 2006 on has actually occurred. The benefits aren't occurring to low-income communities of color. One of the conditions is that they wouldn't make things worse. They wouldn't increase air pollution. And I think that that's, you know, if we were to set that condition, then these projects could not go online, right? If they were going to actually increase pollution at directly where people breathe and live.
Thank you very much. Stephen, why do you think that carbon capture won't get less expensive?
Thanks, Jim. And this is a really important point, because so much of the argument for CCS and so much of the reason it appears in projections and models and plans is because of this presumption that just because it's technology and technology gets cheaper, that it will also get cheaper. And there are two really good reasons to think that that won't be the case. One is because of the fundamental nature of what carbon capture is. So you essentially have to do two chemical reactions to get carbon dioxide from a waste stream into some transportable compressed form. And there you're dealing with kind of fundamental physical, chemical, thermodynamic constraints, right? It requires an enormous amount of energy, an enormous amount of heat. And that isn't, maybe you'll find a catalyst that can do something a little better on the margins, but that's fundamentally not changing and not going anywhere. The other reason is because CCS is not the kind of technology that does get cheaper the way things like, for example, solar or TVs do, right? Small modular technologies where you can produce thousands, millions, billions of copies and get better each time are the kind of thing where you see this rapid, incredibly declining cost curve. CCS, even the Shell Sky scenario, only imagine 10,000 facilities, which is an enormous number of facilities, but not nearly enough trials as you get for things like wind turbines or solar panels. But also, they aren't modular technologies. It's not like you just go to the hardware store and buy a carbon capture unit. You need to basically build a chemical facility next to whatever the emitting facility is that you're trying to capture carbon from. And it has to be more or less bespoke to that facility. So all of those conditions, there's really no reason to expect cost for carbon capture to materially decrease in the manner that proponents expect, and that they even use to argue that we need to do things like support enhanced oil recovery just to, get things moving and get the cost down, because it's probably not going.
Thank you, Stephen. Basaf, you spoke about a lot of the push from the federal government in CCS, but is the push for CCS mainly coming from the federal government? Are there other places?
Well, we just heard from Martha-Dina about how the California Air Resources Board is also pushing carbon capture. There are state governments who are pushing for what's called primacy for injection wells. So there's lots of state governments who are in on this act as well. There are state governments who are competing for the various hydrogen hub proposals that are being funded by the IIJA. And that's all at the governmental level. And then you look at the private sector. If you look at the so-called net zero plans from any big oil and gas company, it revolves around massive amounts of carbon capture. They will tell you that it revolves around massive amounts of carbon capture. They will not tell you that they're asking for massive amounts of governmental subsidies, not just in the US, but all over the world, to fund the rollout of that carbon capture infrastructure. So yes, this push is coming from the federal government and state governments in the United States. It's coming from several foreign governments, like Saudi Arabia is a big proponent of CCS in international spaces. And very much it's coming from industry.
Great, thank you, Basaf. The next question, June, I think you're probably the right person to answer this, but biofuels are being widely promoted as a low carbon type of fuel. And in the US, this mainly takes the form of corn ethanol, but other things as well. But this is what the question is which is being blended with gasoline. Several new pipeline companies are planning to set up CO2 capture operations at corn ethanol plants in the Midwest and then pipe the captured CO2 for underground burial. Can you speak to how effective this process is versus the other processes you had spoken about?
Yeah, so this country's been doing ethanol production for some years now because of the federal requirement, really, of blending ethanol with gasoline. So the new plan is but for that process releases a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. So now in order to take advantage of the federal subsidies around CCS, new companies have been formed, new pipeline companies have been formed to sort of tack CCS onto the ethanol production going on in the United States now, and to then capture the CO2, then pipeline it to storage places in the Midwest, and build 3,000 miles of pipelines to do this. And there's some sort of apparently caginess about how much of this captured CO2 would be used for enhanced oil recovery. But a recent study just came out saying that that US corn-based ethanol, which is what we're talking about here, is worse for the climate than gasoline. That is, the energy intensity of corn ethanol is 24% higher than gasoline. So just looking at the corn ethanol production, without even looking at CCS, it's worse than gasoline. This new study shows when you look at the entire life cycle analysis, the entire process of ethanol production, and then you add on the CCS, with its energy usage to capture the CO2, the energy usage to pipeline it, and the energy usage to bury it underground, all of that's emitting more CO2. And it is basically, counterproductive is the only word to use, really.
Thank you very much, June. I'm going to open this up, and maybe one of the panelists has a specific thought on this, but the question asked is, where are the kind of cutting edge issues that the industry is looking at that we really need to be looking for in the future? Are there things on the horizon that we need to be concerned with, specific projects? I think is what the person's getting at is, as a congressional staffer, you're, want to move forward good policies, but you want to look out for kind of some of the things that are coming down. Are there things that staff should be concerned about the industry might be pushing that relate to this in any way?
Jim, I could mention offsets.
Sure.
Part and parcel of this whole carbon capture thing, both for the biological methods, tree planting, and for the mechanical methods, direct air capture, is carbon credits. And I am astonished at the explosion of offsets trading, so-called trading and carbon credits programs that are just burgeoning across the United States and in other countries. And basically these are methods where, if you buy an airline ticket now, they say to you, oh, pay a little bit more money and cancel out your carbon. So it's everything from us buying airline tickets to the high-tech companies in Silicon Valley, et cetera, paying for carbon credits. All carbon credits do is to pay to pollute. I can continue to pollute if I pay somebody else that's supposedly going to bury some CO2 underground. The studies that have been done have found that these carbon credits and carbon offset programs don't work. They're counterproductive as well. But I think that this carbon offsets, vastly increasing schemes across the country have to be paid attention to a lot.
Great. Thank you so much, June, for raising that. And, I want to point out, one of the things that really gives me hope about this, briefing is that there were a number of questions that I'm looking at here that came in from congressional staff that really speak to what else can we do? And, great, we're going to stop this. We have a real problem addressing the climate here. What do we do? And I know this is touched on a little bit in your presentations, but if everyone would like to just take 30 seconds to real quick, what is it that you would recommend that we do? And so we'll start off with Martha Dina. What should we be doing?
I think rapidly making a decision that we're going to keep as many hydrocarbons in the ground as possible is the first step, right? And be serious about that. And then as serious about that as figuring out what a just transition is. And invest in communities and environmental justice communities to help develop those solutions about what resilience looks like, because we've waited too long. What the jobs of the future look like, because we've waited too long. And for us, in our communities, we worry about scale, right? We have this tendency to think everything has to be big. And maybe as we move, and not maybe, I'm just trying to soften it. As we move into this climate future, big isn't necessarily better. And so be wary of solutions that say we can commodify carbon, and then listen to environmental justice communities and resource them to develop those solutions.
That's great, Martha. We're actually at time, and so we're going to leave it there. But I greatly appreciate your and everyone else's participation in this. Thank you to the congressional staff for being here to meet with us and learn about these important issues going forward. We encourage you to join us for future webinars where we're going to look deeper into these technologies and the harms and that they cause to communities, and why environmental justice and climate organizations are so concerned about this purported climate solution that's being pushed by the fossil fuel industry and big agricultural interests. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Have a great day.
Thanks.